Continuing Cassar from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Nevertheless, his countrymen, conceding all to his fortune and accepting the bit, in the hope that the government of a single person would give them time to breathe after so many civil wars and calamities, made him dictator for life. This was, indeed, a tyranny avowed, since his power now was not only absolute but perpetual too. Cicero made the first proposals to the Senate for conferring honors upon him, which might in some sort be said not to exceed the limits of ordinary human moderation, but others striving which should deserve most carried them so excessively high that they made Caesar odious to the most indifferent and moderate sort of men by the pretensions and extravagance of the titles which they decreed him. His enemies, too, are thought to have had some share in this, as well as his flatterers. It gave them advantage against him, and would be their justification for any attempt they should make upon him. For since the civil wars were ended, he had nothing else that he could be charged with, and they had good reason to decree a temple to clemency in token of their thanks for the mild use he made of his victory. For he had not only pardoned many of those who fought against him, but further to some gave honors and offices, as particularly to Brutus and Cassius, who both of them were praetors. Pompey's images that were thrown down, he set up again, upon which Cicero also said that by raising Pompey's statues he had fixed his own. When his friends advised him to have a guard and several offered their services, he would not hear of it, but said it was better to suffer death once than always to live in fear of it. He looked upon the affections of the people to be the best and surest guard, and entertained them again with public feasting and general distributions of corn, and to gratify his army. He sent out colonies to several places, of which the most remarkable were Carthage and Corinth, which, as before they had been ruined at the same time, so now were restored and repeopled together. As for the men of high rank, he promised to some of them future consulships and praetorships. Some he consoled with other offices and honors, and to all held out hopes of favor by the solicitude he showed to rule with the general goodwill, insomuch that upon the death of Maximus, one day before his consulship was ended, he made Caninius Revilius consul for that day. And when many went to pay the usual compliments and attentions to the new consul, let us make haste, said Cicero, lest the man be gone out of his office before we come. Caesar was born to do great things, and had a passion after honor, and the many noble exploits he had done did not now serve as an inducement to him to sit and reap the fruit of his past labors, but were incentives and encouragements to go on, and raised in him ideas of still greater actions, and a desire of new glory, as if the present were all spent. It was, in fact, a sort of emulous struggle with himself, as if it had been with another, how he might outdo his past actions by his future. In pursuit of these thoughts, he resolved to make war upon the Parthians, and when he had subdued them, to pass through Hyrcania, thence to march along by the Caspian Sea to Mount Caucasus, and so on about Pontus, till he came into Scythia, then to overrun all the countries bordering upon Germany, and Germany itself, and so to return through Gaul and Italy, after completing the whole circle of his intended empire, and bounding it on every side by the ocean, while preparations were Taking for this expedition, he proposed to dig through the isthmus on which Corinth stands, and appointed Ananias to superintend the work. He had also designed of diverting the Tiber and carrying it by a deep channel directly from Rome into Circae, and so into the sea near Tarracina, and that there might be a safe and easy passage for all merchants who traded to Rome. Besides this, he intended to drain all the marshes by Pomentium and Setia, and gain around enough from the water to employ many thousands of men in tillage. He proposed further to make great mounds on the shore nearest Rome to hinder the sea from breaking in upon the land, to clear the coast at Ostia of all the hidden rocks and shoals that made it unsafe for shipping, and to form ports and harbors fit to receive the large number of vessels that would frequent them. These things were designed without being carried into effect, but his reformation of the calendar in order to rectify the irregularity of time was not only projected with great scientific ingenuity, but was brought into its completion and proved of a very great use, for it was not only in ancient time that the Romans had wanted a certain rule to make the revolutions of their months fall in with the course of the year, so that their festivals and solemn days for sacrifices were removed by little and little, till at last they came to be kept at seasons, quite the contrary to what was at first intended. But even this time the people had no way of computing the solar year. Only the priests could say the time, and they at their pleasure, without giving any notice, slipped in the intercalary month, which they called Mercedonius. Numa was the first who put in this month, but his expedient was a poor one, and quite inadequate to correct all the errors that arose in the returns of the annual cycles. And we have shown in his life, Caesar called in the best philosophers and mathematicians of his time to settle the point, and out of the system he had before formed a new and more exact method of correcting the calendar, which the Romans use to this day, and seems to succeed better than any nation in avoiding the errors occasioned by the inequality of the cycles. Yet even this gave offense to those who looked with an evil eye on his position, and felt oppressed by his power. Cicero, the orator, when someone in his company chanced to say the next morning, Laura would rise, replied, yes, in accordance with the edict, as if even this were a matter of compulsion. Now, if we're going, sighting of the crescent to the other, because the new moon to new moon, when the light of the moon is 0, and what's reflected from Earth's perspective, 29 and a little more than a half day. So most of them are 30, so 29 or 30 days, and that's the easiest one to do. But 12 months of those slip 11 days versus the solar calendar, which were people who more accurately predicted the solar calendar. Now, you could go by a week's system, right? And then you wouldn't have even a 19-day, 19-month thing. But then you, again, would have intercalary days. Intercalary. Okay, intercalary is, sorry. And then there's that, zodiac sign to zodiac sign system of month, which is 27.7 days. But then you'd still have to add a day or two every year, because you'd have 13 months, and then, But in this era, it's 12 lunar months, and we can keep track of the sun and other things, but, the sacred calendar is based on something else. But that which brought upon him the most apparent and mortal hatred was his desire of being king, which gave the common people the first occasion to quarrel with him, and proved the most specious pretense to those who would bend his secret enemies all along. Those who would have procured him that title gave it out that it was foretold in the Sibyl's books that the Romans should conquer the Parthians when they fought against them under the conduct of the king, but not before. And one day, as Caesar was coming down from Alba to Rome, some were so bold as to salute him by the name of a king, but he, finding the people disrelish it, seemed to resent it himself, and said his name was Caesar, not king. And, of course, Caesar is like the title nowadays. Now, the Sibyl's books, if you're familiar with this sort of thing, particularly when it's like astrology and stuff, you can say pretty much everything in its opposite. Some require some skill of language and stuff like this, but, it's... yeah, it can be used to predict pretty much anything, or claim that you predict pretty much anything. Upon this, there was a general silence, and he passed on, looking not very well pleased or contented. Another time, when the Senate had conferred on him some extravagant honors, he chanced to receive the message as he was sitting on the rostra, where, though the consuls and praetors themselves waited on him, attended by the whole body of the Senate, he did not rise, but behaved himself to them as if they had been private men, and told them his honors wanted rather to be retrenched than increased. This treatment offended not only the Senate, but the commonalty too, as if they thought the affront upon the Senate equally reflected upon the whole republic, so that all who could decently leave him went off, looking much discomposed. Caesar, perceiving the false step he had made, immediately retired home, and laying his throat bare, told his friends that he was ready to offer this to anyone who would give the stroke. But afterwards he made the malady from which he suffered the excuse for his sitting, saying that those who are attacked by it lose their presence of mind if they talk much standing. They presently grow giddy, fall into convulsions, and quite lose their reason. But this was not the reality, for he would willingly have stood up to the Senate had not Cornelius Balbus, one of his friends, or rather flatterers, hindered him. Will you not remember, said he, you are Caesar, and claim the honor which is due to your merit. He gave a fresh occasion of resentment by his affront to the tribunes. The Lupercalia were then celebrated a feast at the first institution, belonging, as some writers say, to the shepherds, and having some connection with the Arcadian Laca. Many young noblemen and magistrates run up and down the city with their upper garments off, striking all they meet with thongs of hide, by way of sport, and many women, even of the highest rank, place themselves in the way, and hold out their hands to the lash, as boys in a school do to the master, out of the belief that it procures an easy labor to those who are with child, and makes those conceive who are barren. Yeah, I definitely would not say that you seek out abuse, right? Discipline's one thing, but this is not discipline, right? In India, around the 14th of February, Valens means rolling pins. And you behave yourself all year, because there's that one day where the women are like, going to give this man what he deserves. And, Caesar, dressed in a triumphal robe, seated himself in a golden chair at the rostra to view the ceremony. Antony, as consul, was one of those who ran this course, and when he came into the forum, and the people made the way for him, he went up and reached to Caesar, a diadem wreathed with laurel. Upon this there was a shout, but only a slight one, made by the few who were planted there for that purpose. But when Caesar refused it, there was universal applause. Upon the second offer, very few, and upon the second refusal, All again applauded. Caesar, finding it would not take, rose up and ordered the crown to be carried into the Capitol. Caesar's statues were afterwards found with royal diadems on their heads. Flavius and Marellus, 2 tribunes of the people, went presently and pulled them off, having apprehended those who first saluted Caesar as king and committed them to prison. The people followed them with acclamations and called them by the name of Brutus, because Brutus was the first who ended the succession of kings and transferred the power which before was lodged in one man into the hands of the Senate and people. Caesar so far resented this, that he displaced Marellus and Flavius, and in urging his charges against them, at the same time ridiculed the people, by himself giving the men more than once the names of Bruti and Camae. This made the multitude turn their thoughts to Marcus Brutus, who by his father's side was thought to be descended from the first Brutus, and by his mother's side from Civilii, another noble family, being besides nephew and son-in-law to Cato. But the honors and favors he had received from Caesar took off the edge from the desires he might himself have felt for overthrowing the new monarchy, for he had not only been pardoned himself after Pompey's defeat at Pharsalia, and had not procured the same grace for many of his friends, but was one in whom Caesar had a particular confidence. He had at that time the most honorable praetorship for the year, and was named for the consulship 4 years after, being preferred before Cassius, his competitor. Upon the question as to the choice, Caesar, it is related, said that Cassius had the fairer pretensions, but that he could not pass by Brutus, nor would he afterwards listen to some who spoke against Brutus, but when the conspiracy against him was already afoot, but laying his hand upon his body, said to the informers, Brutus will await for this skin of mine, intimating that he was worthy to bear rule on account of his virtue, but would not be base and ungrateful to gain it. Those who desired a change, and looked on him as the only, or at least the most proper person to effect it, did not venture to speak with him, but in the night time laid papers about his chair of state, where he used to sit and determine causes, with such sentences in them as, "You are asleep, Brutus. You are no longer Brutus." Cassius, when he perceived his ambition a little raised upon this, was more instant than before to work him yet further, having himself a private grudge against Caesar for some reasons that we have mentioned in the life of Brutus. Nor was Caesar without suspicion of him, and said once to his friends, "What do you think Cassius is aiming at? I don't like him. He looks so pale." And when it was told that Antony and Dolabella were in a plot against him, he said he did not fear such fat, luxurious men, but rather the pale, lean fellows, meaning Cassius and Brutus. Fate, however, is to all appearance and more unavoidable than unexpected, for many strange prodigies and apparitions are said to have been observed shortly before this event, as to the lights in the heavens, the noises heard in the night, and the wild birds which perched in the forum. These are not, perhaps, worth taking notice of in so great a case as this. Strabo, the philosopher, tells us that a number of men were seen, looking as if they were heated through with fire, contending with each other, that a quantity of flame issued from the hand of a soldier's servant, so that they who saw it thought he must be burnt, but that after all he had no hurt. As Caesar was sacrificing, the victim's heart was missing, a very bad omen, because no living creature can subsist without a heart. One finds it also related by many that a soothsayer bade him prepare for some great danger on the Ides of March. When this day was come, Caesar, as he went to the Senate, met this soothsayer, and said to him, by way of raillery, "The Ides of March are come," who answered him calmly, "Yes, they are come, but they are not past." The day before his assassination, he supped with Marcus Lepidus, and he was signing some letters according to his custom. As he reclined at table, there arose a question, what sort of death was the best, at which he immediately, before anyone could speak, said, a sudden one. After this he was in bed with his wife. All the doors and windows of the house flew open together. He was startled at the noise, and the light which broke into the room, and sat up in his bed, where by the moonshine he perceived Calpurnia fast asleep, but heard her utter in her dream some indistinct words and inarticulate groans. She fancied at that time she was weeping over Caesar, and holding him butchered in her arms. Others say that this was not her dream, but that she dreamed that a pinnacle, which the Senate, as Livy relates, had ordered to be raised on Caesar's house by way of ornament and grandeur, was tumbling down, which was the occasion of her tears and ejaculations. When it was day, she begged of Caesar, if it were possible, not to stir out, but to adjourn the Senate to another time, and if he slighted her dreams, that she would be pleased to consult his fate by sacrifices and other kinds of divination. Nor was he himself without some suspicion and fears, for he never before discovered any womanish superstition on Calpurnia, whom he now saw in such great alarm, upon the report which the priest made to him, that they had killed several sacrifices, and still found them inauspicious. He resolved to send Antony to dismiss the Senate. In the juncture, Decimus Brutus, surnamed Albinus, one whom Caesar had such confidence in that he made him his second heir, who nevertheless was engaged in the conspiracy with the other Brutus and Cassius, fearing lest, if Caesar should put off the Senate to another day, the business might get wind, spoken scoffingly and in mockery of the diviners, and blamed Caesar for giving the Senate so fair an occasion of saying he'd put a slight upon them, for that they were met upon by his summons, and were ready to vote unanimously that he should be declared king of all the provinces out of Italy, and might wear a diadem in any other place but Italy, by sea or land. And if anyone should be sent to tell them that they might break up for the present, and meet again when Calpurnia should chance to have better dreams, what would his enemies say? Or who would with any patience hear his friends, if they should presume to defend his government as not arbitrary and tyrannical? But if he was possessed so far as to think this day unfortunate, yet it were more decent to go himself to the Senate, and to adjourn it in his own person. Brutus, as he spoke these words, took Caesar by the hand, and conducted him forth. He was not gone far from the door, when a servant of some other persons made towards him, but not being able to come up to him on account of the crowd of those who pressed about him, he made his way into the house, and committed himself to Calpurnia, begging of her to secure him till Caesar return, because he had matters of great importance to communicate to him. Artemidorus, a Canadian, a teacher of Greek logic, and by that means so far acquainted with Brutus and his friends as to have gotten into the secret. He brought Caesar in a small written memorial the heads of what he had to dispose. He had observed that Caesar, as he received any papers presently, gave them to the servants who attended on him, and therefore came as near to him as he could, and said, "Read this, Caesar, alone and quickly, for it contains a matter of great importance, which nearly concerns you." Caesar received it, and tried several times to read it, but it was still hindered by the crowd of those who came to speak with him. However, he kept it in his hand by itself till he came into the Senate. Some say that it was another who gave Caesar this note, and that Artemidorus could not get to him, being all along kept off by the crowd. All these things might happen by chance, but the place which was destined for the scene of this murder, in which the Senate met that day, was the same in which Pompey's statue stood, and was one of the edifices which Pompey had raised and dedicated with his theater to the use of the public, plainly showing that there was something of the supernatural influence which guided the action and ordered it to that particular place. Cassius, just before the act, is said to have looked towards Pompey's statue and silently implored his assistance, though he had been inclined to the doctrines of Epicurus. But this occasion and the instant danger carried him away out of all his reasonings, and filled him for the time with a sort of inspiration. As for Antony, who was firm to Caesar and a strong man, Brutus Albinus kept him outside his house, and delayed him with a long conversation, contrived on purpose. When Caesar entered, the Senate stood up to show their respect to him, and of Brutus's confederates, some came about his chair and stood behind it. Others met him, pretending to add their petitions to those of Tilius Cimber in behalf of his brother, who was in exile, and they followed him with their joint applications till he came to his seat. When he was sat down, he refused to comply with their request, and upon their urging him further, began to reproach them severely for their importunities. When Tilius, laying hold of his robe with both his hands, pulled it down from his neck, which was the signal for the assault, Casca gave him the first cut in the neck, which was not mortal nor dangerous, as coming from one who at the beginning of such a bold action was probably very much disturbed. Caesar immediately turned about, and laid his hand upon the dagger, and kept hold of it, and both of them at the same time cried out that he received the blow, in Latin, Villa Casca. What does that mean? And he gave it in Greek to his brother. Brother, help. Well, what's the Greek phrase? Upon this first onset, those who were not privy to the design were astonished, and their horror and amazement at what they saw were so great that they durst not fly, nor assist Caesar, nor so much as speak a word. But those who came prepared for the business enclosed him on every side, with their naked daggers in their hands. Which way soever he turned, he met with blows, and saw their swords levelled at his face and eyes, which were encompassed like a wild beast in the toils on every side. For it had been agreed they should each of them make a thrust at him, and flesh themselves with his blood, for which reason Brutus also gave him one stab in the groin. Some say that he fought and resisted all the rest, shifting his body to avoid the blows and calling out for help, but that when he saw Brutus's sword drawn, he covered his face with his robe and submitted, letting himself fall, whether it were by chance or that he was pushed in that direction by his murderers. At the foot of the pedestal on which Pompey's statue stood, and which was thus wetted with his blood, so that Pompey himself seemed to have presided, as it were, over the revenge done upon his adversary, who lay here at his feet, and breathed out his soul through his multitude of wounds. For they say he received 23, and the conspirators themselves were many of them wounded by each other, whilst they all levied their blows at the same person. When Caesar was dispatched, Brutus stood forth to give a reason for what they had done, but the Senate would not hear him, but flew out of doors in all haste, and filled the people with so much alarm and distraction that some shut up their houses, others left their counters and shops. All ran one way or the other, some to the place to see the sad spectacle, others back again after they had seen it. Antony and Lepidus, Caesar's most faithful friends, got off privately and hid themselves in some friends' houses. Brutus and his followers, being yet hot from the deed, marched in a body from the Senate house to the Capitol with their drawn swords, not like persons who thought of escaping, but with an air of confidence and assurance, and as they went along called the people to resume their liberty, and invited the company of any more distinguished people whom they met, and among those joined the procession and went up along with them, as if they also had been of the conspiracy, and could claim a share in the honor of what had been done, as for example Caius, Octavius, and Lentulus Spinther, who suffered afterwards for their vanity, being taken off by Antony and the young Caesar, and lost the honor they desired, as well as their lives, which it cost them, since no one believed they had any share in the action, for neither did those who punished them profess to revenge the fact, but the ill will the day after Brutus with the rest came down from the Capitol and made a speech to the people, who listened without expressing either any pleasure or resentment, but showed by their silence that they pitied Caesar and respected Brutus. The Senate passed acts of oblivion for what was past, and took measures to reconcile all parties. They ordered that Caesar should be worshipped as a divinity, and nothing even of the slightest consequence should be revoked which he had enacted during his government. At the same time he gave Brutus and his followers the command of provinces and other considerable posts, so that all the people now thought things were well settled and brought to the happiest adjustment. Now, it shouldn't be the thing in government that, oh, this guy's in power, so he changes everything that the last guy does and all this other stuff. And a lot of that's just so they can overturn what the last guy did, not because it's better to overturn it. Now, if it was better to overturn it, that'd be a different story, but. But when Caesar's will was opened, and it was found that he had left a considerable legacy to each one of the Roman citizens, and when his body was seen carried through the marketplace, all mangled with wounds, the multitude could no longer contain themselves within the bounds of tranquillity and order, but heaped together a pile of benches, bars, and tables, which they placed the corpse on, and setting fire to it, burnt it on them. Then they took brands from the pile and ran some to fire the houses of the conspirators. Well, set fire would be the way we phrase it now, because fire the houses, like what, are the houses hired or what? Others up and down the city to find out the men and tear them to pieces, but met, however, with none of them, they having taken effectual care to secure themselves. One Cinna, a friend of Caesar's, chanced the night before to have had an odd dream. He fancied that Caesar invited him to supper, and that upon his refusal to go with him, Caesar took him by the hand and forced him, though he hung back. Upon hearing the report that Caesar's body was burning in the marketplace, he got up and went thither out of respect to his memory, though his dream gave him some ill apprehensions, and thought he was suffering from a fever. One of the crowd who saw him there asked another who that was, and having learned his name, told it to his neighbor. It presently passed for certainty that he was one of Caesar's murderers, as indeed there was another Cinna, a conspirator, and they, taking this to be the man, immediately seized him and tore him limb from limb on the spot. Brutus and Cassius, frightened at this, within a few days retired out of the city. What they afterwards did and suffered, and how they died, is written in the life of Brutus. Caesar died in his 56th year, not having survived Pompey above 4 years. That empire and power which he had pursued through the whole course of his life with so much hazard, he did at last with much difficulty compass, but reap no other fruits from it than the empty name and invidious glory. But the great genius which attended him through his lifetime, even after his death, remained as the avenger of his murder, pursuing through every sea and land all those who were concerned in it, and suffering none to escape, but reaching all who in any sort of or kind were either actually engaged in the fact, or by their counsels anyway promoted it. Some of that might be overstating what one should do, but certainly when there is a murder, at least those physically taking part in it and paying for it should endure the consequences, whether it's an honor killing or whatever. And speaking of honor killings, if you talk in other countries than America, you can have 20 people executed for one honor killing, and that's a huge deterrent. That's why it's so less popular over there. It's like a big story. But when somebody gets killed because of being disrespected in my own county, one may not hear of it, or your own city or whatever. It's one of the top reasons for